For the next session, I invite our esteemed guest Billy Cobbett to join Aromar Revi in a dialogue. How individual capacity building can develop institutional capacities in urban India and the global south. William Cobbett, or Billy Cobbett as he is known widely, is the former director of Cities Alliance, a global partnership for urban poverty reduction and promotion of the role of cities in sustainable development, where he served for 2 decades. Prior to this, he served the shelter branch of the UN Habitat, where he designed and launched the Global Campaign for Secure Tenure. He has held several positions, including in the local government in his native South Africa. Welcome to CDF, Billy. Over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Billy. Sorry for getting you up so early in the day. It's a pleasure.
Aromar, it's 9 o'clock here. It's late. I normally go to the gym beforehand. So nice to see you. And thank you for the participation, the opportunity.
Yeah. So, I mean, this has been something that, a number of us, and especially you and I, have talked to over, many years. This is one of the binding constraints to the transformation of many cities in Africa and, of course, much of South Asia. And that's where we're going to be seeing the big shifts that are taking place over the next 15 or 20 years or so. So, I mean, given that background, what do you think the core drivers for capacity development are? I mean, where do you think the opportunities lie, both from your experience, which is quite extensive in Africa, but also in other parts of the world? India, probably as well as many of us do in the country.
Well, it's been a few years since I did my last visit. So the next one post-COVID is going to be very, very welcome. I think the first thing to say that in the name of capacity building, many crimes have been committed and continue to be committed, particularly in the way that it's thought of and designed often by international development agencies, where capacity building is in fact a very superficial exercise where they count numbers of people who attend workshops that they have designed. And so this is entirely the wrong emphasis because it is unconnected. I would start off by picking up on 2 of the points that you've made, because in my sense, capacity building has to be for a purpose and it has to be transformational. And your emphasis on looking to the future and not being trapped by the past is fundamental. And on your last slide, you had some key bullet points. The one I would pick up on is, of course, the link to reform, which is why are we building capacity and what are we trying to achieve? And unless there is a very clear framework, even if it is a bit confused at the moment, there has to be purpose, why we are building individual capacity, and above all else, and I will always link individual capacity to those of institutions, because the issue of scale and transforming is at the top of the agenda. And so for me, the most important is the rationale for the capacity. Why are we building capacity and what are we trying to achieve? And is there a common purpose? And if that's clear, you can have a range of different ways to achieve that and different institutions. And I think that is emerging in the challenge, whether it's recognized or not, in the way that you have framed the transformation, the urban transformation that is underway in India. That necessarily sets the agenda. But not all parties will have an agreement on what the end goal is.
That's true. So, I mean, Billy, if you want to get a little concrete on this, any examples of the transformatory potential of capacity building that you've seen in different geographies? I mean, you work pretty much across the world.
I've picked out 5, but let me start off with 2. One, because it's personal, and that was running an urban NGO in Johannesburg at the time of the transition from apartheid. And it was I ran a small urban NGO, which was a core group of professionals.
Mm-hmm.
You may say we were a big one?
In 94.
No, this is before. This is 88.
Okay.
For a while, it was still under the state of emergency. So we were getting foreign funding, which was a critical, it was an anti-apartheid thing, but our focus was on urban development, the role of local government, and of course, inclusive cities, all of those good languages. We ended up providing support to the mass-based organizations. In that case, it was a team led by Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now the president. And it got into local level negotiations with the apartheid state. And so there were 2 levels of capacity building. One is they turned around to us and said, you provide us with the agenda and the tools, the technical tools to do the negotiations, evidence, strategies, policies. And so we, to be perfectly frank, no one called that capacity building. My capacity was built in 2 years. I had no alternative but to get good. I had to learn multidisciplinary things. So the learning by doing is a very fun. But we went one extra step, and that is we employed a shadow team that worked with us, which came from Soweto itself, because these were negotiations about Soweto. And within my team, 2 or 3 of those people eventually became city managers, not because they were on the team, but also because they were part of that team. So it was, but the purpose of the negotiations and why we did research and why I had to become an expert in electricity pricing was to understand the city. And so that was a very forced, high pressure political transition, which is maybe not always replicable. So the other example I will give you, because it does link back also to India, is in Uganda, where we had a program. At that time I was with the Cities Alliance, and it was meant to transform the role of secondary cities in the national economy. And so we provided funding. This was external funding, but it was done very programmatically. And with the national government, we provided local authority funding. But the key trick, I think, was to provide funding to local organizations which emerged over a period and became a national federation of slum dwellers. And why that was so important for the capacity building is their own methodology, which had been learnt from Asia, learned from IIHS in South Asia and the likes of Mahila Malan and NSDF in India, was built on 2 things. The enumeration, in other words, the generation of data that local governments didn't have, which became a powerful tool, and the daily savings, which was the discipline that led to the emergence of organizations and practice. And so those 2 examples meant that those 2 approaches led to the creation of organizations. It demonstrated accountability and it demonstrated responsibility. But the individual behavior only made sense in an organizational framework. I don't know if those help.
No, they're good, Billy. But the thing is, I mean, just to be provocative from the Indian point of view, some of our biggest challenges are inside state institutions. So you talked about 2 examples that are sort of on the inside out, a transition in South Africa, which helps the apartheid transition, another one that brings in civil society and engagement with others. So are there any other sort of good or bad examples of how state institutions, local governments or regional governments can actually transform their orientation because of leadership, because of individuals or institutional changes that are linked to reform?
Well, all of those, the first example started from the outside and went inside. So at the time of the transition from apartheid, almost all of the staff from the organization which I ran ended up in positions and with networks and a methodology and approach inside local government. And so they were individuals in powerful places, transformative. The example that I would give you in this regard is the response of the Ethiopian government, and it's a difficult government to discuss at the moment because of what's happening in the country. But in a previous period, when the government lost its election because basically because it hadn't understood the urban areas, the response was very, very intelligent and fast, which was to approach a capacity building organization not dissimilar to IIHS. This was IIHS in Rotterdam, who ran a master's course on urban governance. And they challenged and required the IIHS academics to redraft the course in an Ethiopian context, and then to implant it in what became the Ethiopian Civil Service University. And that then led to the mass training of urban professionals at a master's level, and in the numbers of thousands. And this was, who is going to run our secondary cities and what do they know? And there was no tradition because, like India, they had a concept that, looking backwards, was sort of like more village and rural focused, and didn't understand the imperative of understanding the urban management challenge. But I would still retain very strongly your emphasis on changing the state is important, and you need cadres inside state institutions, but I would still stress very critically the role of external organizations like universities and like independent NGOs that generate independent data, different analysis, and above all else, challenge the public narrative. Because until you start changing those public narratives, winning fights inside the ULBs, I mean, that they have to be echoed outside. It can't just look like an insurgency.
No, I agree. That's actually, it's interesting you mentioned that, because IIHS was involved in the early 80s in setting up the human settlements management, HSMI, in which of course many of us have been through in the early 80s, which actually, like you said just now, has influenced, and a number of the leaders in the country in the space have been through that or engaged with that in some sense.
And they've kept an alumni. They have a network that keeps plugging back in, forward and backwards, and I admire that a great deal.
Exactly. So I mean, it's not that India hasn't had that. The challenge, I think, is we lost a trick, I guess, in the 1990s, where, you know, that's in a sense the lost decade of urbanization in India, or at least urban reform.
Let me provoke on that, because as you say, I used to visit India a lot, and I used to always end up in the slums of Dharavi and all over and I would always struck me, and I remember having the discussion with the Vice Chancellor at the time of the University of Bombay, and my question to him was, how come when I go into the slums of Dharavi, I see students from UCL in London, and I see MIT and Harvard and Yale or wherever, and I don't see Indian students going in and doing primary research in one of the biggest laboratories of our urban transition in the world? He didn't have a particularly good answer other than to agree with me. And I think that's the narrative to change. Exactly.
That's an important part of that change, along with the fact that, I mean, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been working with India's Superior Civil Service. You know, we've touched at least a couple of thousand people, but the challenge is, as let's say an IS officer, you know, you move in 6 months from animal husbandry to urban to finance. It becomes very difficult then to do what you spoke about in Africa, and that is that you have a generation of city managers who come from struggles on the ground, an understanding of the local realities of dealing with housing and service delivery, and then
is that model of urban governance being critiqued and challenged? Because when I've met, I mean, the IS officers I've always met have always been people of the highest level of intelligence and integrity, but their accountability is upwards. They are not. They are more worried about what the PM's officers are going to put them next to, whether they're going to go to forestry in Tamil Nadu or to go and run Bengaluru. But it's you have high levels of skill, but they get transplanted, and there's a high degree of uncertainty about their future for the next year or 2 years. I've come across that at state level and at city level so many times in India.
Yeah, that hasn't changed too much, excepting because I guess the demographics and the political economy is changing. People do recognize, and the new generation of reform programs have thrown up a whole range of younger people. But, you know, the IS is kind of only one part of that sort of system that's there.
Sure.
Your challenge is in the middle management of the agencies that deliver water, that deliver power, that manage land, etc. And there, you know, like I said, there's a huge professional gaps in terms of professional training in some senses. And then you come into an environment in which, you know, you don't necessarily understand the municipal laws in some ways. So one of the interesting things I guess other colleagues in the space will talk about is that when a new municipal commissioner comes in, you know, they're searching around for somebody who can help them understand, you know, what kind of legislation they're dealing with, because they never worked in that space. Or even in the private sector, people don't necessarily understand, you know, how regulation works and how it can actually play itself forward.
But there are huge skills in urban local government in India. I mean, when we were trying to do a model, we were doing research into cities in Africa, and we were trying to construct what is an ideal local government. You know, your triangle where you had leadership, middle management. We were trying to say, what if you're running a city of 300,000 people, what is the proportion of skills that you need and personnel? And the only place where we could find this was in India, where we went to City Managers Association. And I remember detailed discussions with the City Managers Association, Karnataka. These were people who absolutely had the data, had the understanding, but seemed not to be involved in the policy formulation. And it's breaking down those barriers.
Yeah, we have colleagues here, I think, from the All India Institute for Local Self-Government and other capacity building institutions. And, you know, in some senses, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a creation of a whole new generation of administrative training institutes at one end, but also specialized institutions that worked on good governance, like in Andhra Pradesh. There's a new one that's been just created now in Madhya Pradesh, etc., who are trying to bring together the capacities that exist, but trying to deal with this question of disempowerment. Also, the other challenge is because we've moved from very little investment in urban areas to very mission-driven programs. The focus then goes on to a particular sector, and it then depends on the state government, very often in India at least, to make the integration between water and power and land or X and Y and Z. So any reflections on the orientation of sector or project-led initiatives, which in many cases international development agencies love, and then they create institutions which lead to fragmentation. Any thoughts on that, and how do individuals navigate that kind of space?
Well, in the spaces of urban management, which are local bodies, cities, towns, you cannot have a sectoral approach to management. No mayor can only know about 2 or 3 sectors and not know about all of the sectors. And also, they are all integrated. And I've often said before, and I'll say again, I don't know of any city in the world where everything works except one sector. And so you only have to go in and fix one. So we're coming in with a water project. Well, hooray for you. But and so this has been a big disease. When we were working in my first example in the Plan Act NGO, that is why, I mean, I came in with, we had lawyers understanding what planning meant and what sewage looked like, because how do you make sense of a local authority and of the lived experience of the residents? So there is a role for sectoral, but unless they are contextualized within citywide programming, they can actually do more damage than good. And we have seen that. And it's so again, we keep coming back time and time again to the institutional architecture of the local government, and your reference to the 74th Amendment and its failure. In fact, it was I remember one of my discussions in then Bangalore, it was just so fragmented. There was no way to fix it without redoing the whole thing. This was in the water and waste sectors.
Exactly. I mean, in Bangalore, I think we have 90 different agencies that deal with services.
There you go.
So it's a fundamental challenge. And also, I guess the issue here is that apart from the 74th Amendment question that's there, at least to speak very frankly here, there is this appreciation that planning, as we practice it, which is, at least in India, still draws upon a tradition which kind of was given up in the UK, which is not the best example in the world, in the 1950s and 60s. So physical planning really is the mechanism to bring together economic development, transportation, environmental issues, and inequality. And frankly, that's putting too much responsibility on too few people who don't have necessarily the opportunities of dealing with it. So that's the other issue that's there. Our instruments are not adequate, and in some senses, the disciplines that we work with have limitations, especially in this matrix. So, and any reflections on that and how that works in Africa, in Southeast Asia, or even Latin America for that matter?
Well, yeah, it's fundamental, because planning is not a neutral tool. I mean, apartheid cities were very carefully planned by planners, and so what's the purpose of planning is the key answer. And I've just lost my train of thought right there. Planning.
Yeah, so go ahead. Yeah.
It goes back to the higher purpose, which is to turn planning into a tool trying to achieve what, as opposed to give the carte blanche to the planners. And planning needs to be transformative, but most planning, let me go back to my point from a different angle. In all of my experience in Latin America, in India, certainly, and in Africa, the default position of most governments is, in fact, anti-poor. And planning becomes a tool and you don't need to have it planned. You can have redlining in American cities without any legislation, or you can have explicit apartheid planning in the design of cities in Malawi and in South Africa, and indeed in India. And so that's where the transformative exercise of the capacity building that IIHS is so important, because capacity building for what purpose? What is the vision that we're trying to build? that then completely changes how we look at planning. If you are trying to use planning not only for the niceness of the suburbs, but to integrate the city and to break down patterns of social exclusion and inequality, it becomes a radically different tool. And so this is, unfortunately, always small p, this is a political exercise. If you are not bent on transforming Indian or African cities, then capacity building is not something that I'm particularly interested in. You know, it is that exercise.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think is that's one of the reasons why, if you look at these processes as very limited sectoral processes where you're trying to increase the technical skills of individuals, in some senses, you know, maybe you'll get a better property tax system, maybe you'll get, you know, a certain amount of additional money that comes in terms of your water supply, etc. But as far as the citizen is concerned and the larger experience of the city, it's very difficult to deliver, you know, stuff that's very much more active. And I guess the challenge for us in India is a structural one. Our mayors are very few and far between, and where they are, they don't necessarily have significant power. Most of that is held with state governments, who are reluctant to actually devolve in some ways. So I think part of that political equation is changing in some ways. And in some senses, what I hear you reaching out for is both whether they're public institutions involved in capacity development, those that are created by international institutions to further, you know, their lending interests in some senses, or those that sit in academia or civil society. There needs to be a way of trying to cross those boundaries and challenge, in some senses, the older ways of doing things which are not delivering.
Has to be, and you're in the position of having the data to present a legitimate critique of the way in which urban form currently takes place in India, and to point out the long-term consequences of this, which will be, unless transformed, greater inequality and less efficiency in the national economy. Can I throw in one last throwaway comment of a disease that I've always found that is at the back of capacity, not in capacity building, the environment of capacity building, and that is the tyranny of the expert. You know, in so many cases I have found that the expert, be they of a different race or a different nationality or a different geography, is what is sought to come in and say what everyone's been saying in the local environment for 10 years, but because the outsider says it, it becomes true. And I'm sure you will recognize that. And it's having that confidence, because the capacity that exists in all of the institutions I've seen in India is more than enough. It's whether the common purpose is really and the transformative ability of this is, that's where the agenda is set, because the technical skills and the people skills, they're there, but they've not always been used to the transformative purpose.
Okay, that's a good way to end. You started with the provocation saying, be careful of people from the outside who bring gifts.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Also, you know, to rely on the capacities that you have, both technical and otherwise, and actually to speak to the challenges that we are facing in very, very direct terms. Because I mean, this is really about the transformation of institutions, and institutions cannot be transformed without, you know, individuals changing their own, you know, their own positions. And at least in my experience of this, you have to go first from critique, which is where a lot of us kind of stop, to proposition, which is where a lot of urban transformation starts with, but finally to agency, because if
Absolutely.
the agency is not there inside the local government institutions, private institutions, or otherwise, it's not going to work itself forward. So anyway, thanks so much. That was a good opening sort of session. We are trying to provoke people to come out and speak very frankly about their experiences. And you know, there's a long way to go in this process, and we're happy to keep this conversation going. So thanks a lot, Billy. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
As always, thanks for the opportunity, and good luck with the course. Ciao.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Billy and Aro. This dialogue has given us an excellent picture of how far we've come in capacity development and the long way we have ahead of us. Such truths about importance of narratives, the roles that individuals and organizations have to play, is really, really important right now. And we're all still learning by doing in the capacity development sector as well. So yeah, we'll keep learning. Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Aro.